I never thought a random Saturday morning would turn into something straight out of a drama series. It started off simple, me heading out to check on our side yard after noticing a strange noise near the fence. That's when I caught our HOAs. Most notorious busybodylets call her Karens, snooping around inside our property like she owned the place. Not on the sidewalk, not at the gate inside. At first, I honestly thought she was lost or looking for a cat or something, but nope. She was poking around, clipboard in hand, snapping pictures like she was on some kind of secret mission. I calmly asked what she was doing, and that's when the tone changed. She immediately got defensive, claiming I was threatening her just because I asked a question on my own property. Next thing I know, she's dialing 911 in a panic, saying there's a hostile man and she fears for her safety. Meanwhile, I'm just standing there in disbelief, hands by my sides, wondering how this flipped so fast. Now, here's the twist she didn't see coming. My wife is a 911 dispatcher. And guess who picked up the call? Yep, she recognized Karen's voice instantly from prior complaints and HOA drama and kept her calm, gathering the facts. But what Karen didn't know was that this time, she wasn't in control of the narrative. What happened next took everything up a notch, and let's just say, when the police showed up, things didn't go how Karen expected. But before I get into that, let me show you exactly what led up to the call and the footage I caught that changed everything. Because when someone like Karen gets too confident and doesn't realize who's really on the other end of the line, it makes for one unforgettable showdown. So let me back up a little and explain how we even got to this point. We moved into this neighborhood about 2 years ago, hoping for peace, a sense of community, and just some normal suburban living. What we didn't expect was an HOA board that acted more like a neighborhood patrol, with Karen leading the charge. She's the kind of person who writes up violations if your trash bins are out 5 minutes late, or if your grass looks too wild after a light rain. Always watching, always with that same fake smile and a camera phone in hand. At first, we tried to be friendly early. We did. We went to HOA meetings, waved when we passed her, even invited her to a block BBQ once. But the more we tried to play nice, the more she zeroed in on us. It started with harmless notes about our front lights being too bright. Then she claimed our mailbox was off regulation. When that didn't rattle us, she moved on to accusing us of having an unapproved garden box, something half the block has. And now, this. Actually trespassing just to find something to report. What made it worse was that this wasn't the first time someone had mentioned her being on other people's property without permission. But no one ever had proof till now. I had recently installed a couple of discreet cameras around the house after a few plants went missing from our side yard. I didn't think I'd catch a neighbor, especially not her. The footage from that morning showed everything, her slipping through the side gate without knocking, looking around like she was on an investigation. And when she saw me watching from the back porch, she froze for a second, then pulled out her phone. I couldn't believe it, but I knew the moment she hit dial. This was going to be bigger than just a neighborly dispute. As Karen stood there on the phone, pacing in my yard like she owned it, I couldn't help but wonder what exactly she was trying to gain. Was she hoping to get me in trouble? Intimidate us into silence? Maybe she thought calling 911 would scare me into backing down. But what she didn't realize was that this time, her plan was unraveling fast in real time. Could see it all play out right in front of me, but I stayed calm. I didn't yell. I didn't move toward her. I just stood there with my phone recording, knowing my wife was on the other end of her call, hearing every word. My wife later told me Karen had tried to twist the story, claiming I'd cornered her and wouldn't let her leave. But the footage said otherwise. Karen was moving freely, waving her hands, walking back and forth, even taking more pictures while waiting for the cops. And when my wife asked her basic questions like why she was on private property, Karen danced. around them saying she had HOA business to handle. But even in HOA rules, there's no clause that gives someone the right to walk into someone's fenced yard without permission. Meanwhile, word started spreading around the neighborhood. A couple of neighbors peeked out from their windows, curious about the flashing lights and raised voices. One of them, Dave, who lives across the street, had his own history with Karen. He'd once been fined for having a holiday decoration out past the approved removal date. He came over quietly and whispered that this didn't surprise him one bit. He even mentioned he'd seen Karen snooping near his driveway a few nights back. That's when it hit me, maybe this wasn't just about us. Maybe Karen's been crossing the line with more people than anyone realized. And now, with actual proof and a 911 call on record, things were finally starting to crack. But the real storm hadn't hit yet. That was still coming. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, and I could see Karen straighten up like she was preparing for a performance. She took a few steps back from the gate, trying to make it look like she hadn't just been trespassing. But I already had the footage, and my wife was still quietly listening in on the call, staying professional while mentally connecting all the dots. Karen had no idea the dispatcher she was feeding this story to was married to the suspect. She was accusing. As the police car pulled up, Karen waved them down with an over-the-top urgency, pointing toward me as if I was some kind of threat. The officers calmly approached, asking both of us to step aside and explain what happened. I stayed polite, handed over my phone, and let them watch the clip her walking through the gate, taking photos, then calling 911 as if she'd been attacked. One officer raised his eyebrows slightly while watching, clearly picking up that something didn't add up. Karen, though, kept pushing. She told them she had received complaints from other homeowners about our yard, that she was doing her duty to protect neighborhood standards. But when asked to name the complaints or show documents that gave her permission to enter private property, she suddenly got vague. She repeated phrases like HOA guidelines and verbal authorizations, but nothing concrete. Her voice started to waver a bit, like she realized her story wasn't as solid as she thought. At the same time, my wife texted me from the dispatch office. They're flagging this call for review. Officers know the whole background now. That was the moment I knew things were about to shift. But in that moment, right before anything was decided, tension hung in the air like a wire ready to snap. Neighbors were now gathering, whispering, watching. Karen's mask of confidence was cracking, but she was still standing her ground for now. Just when I thought things couldn't get more surreal, one of the officers got a call on his radio and stepped aside. A minute later, he walked back over, this time looking straight at Karen with a much more serious tone. "Ma'am," he said, "dispatch just confirmed you've made multiple calls like this before involving different neighbors, always with similar accusations." Karen's face stiffened. She tried to play it off, saying she was just being vigilant and that the neighborhood had gone downhill lately. But the officer didn't look convinced. Then came the twist none of us saw coming. Another neighbor. Mrs. Ramirez came forward from the growing crowd. She said loudly, "I have cameras too. Last week, this woman was in my backyard while I was at work." She said she was checking for fence violations. A few others started murmuring, some nodding. Turns out, Karen's been doing this for months, sneaking onto private property, making phone calls, and claiming she's acting on behalf of the HOA, even though no official paperwork ever backs her up. And that's when the police officer made a call of his own, this time to the HOA president. We all stood there in silence, listening to Karen fidget and pace, trying to look like this was all a misunderstanding. But as soon as the HOA president answered, the officer put the call on speaker. The voice on the other end was clear. "She's not authorized to do inspections. That's not her role. We've already warned her about this behavior." You could feel the shift instantly. Karen's authority, her go-to weapon in the neighborhood, was slipping right through her fingers. But even then, she didn't back down. Instead, she doubled down, claiming she was being set up and targeted. The scene was spiraling, and no one quite knew what would happen next. All I knew was, this was no longer just about a phone. Call or Offense It was about finally pulling back the curtain on someone who thought the rules didn't apply to her. The moment the HOA president's voice confirmed that Karen had no authority, it was like the air shifted. The officers exchanged a quick glance, then turned back to her, this time no longer treating her as some concerned citizen they were, treating her as someone who had just crossed a serious line. One officer calmly asked her to step aside so they could sort out a few things. Karen, visibly shaken now, muttered something about getting her lawyer and tried to walk away. But they gently stopped her to continue the conversation. Meanwhile, the crowd of neighbors was growing. More people came out of their homes, whispering, nodding, sharing quiet stories about run-ins with Karen. What had started as a random incident on my lawn had now turned into a full-on neighborhood reckoning. I even heard someone say they were going to call for a special HOA meeting to discuss her behavior. It was clear that this had been building for a long time, and today was just the tipping point. As one officer reviewed the footage again on my phone and another took statements from neighbors, Karen stood off to the side, her eyes darting around, trying to hold on to whatever control she thought she still had. And just when I thought the situation had finally hit its peak, my wife, still at the dispatch center, sent one last message. Internal records show she's made over a dozen false or misleading calls in the past year. They're opening a file on her now. That was it. The conflict, the trespassing, the manipulation, it all led to this moment. Karen was no longer the neighborhood enforcer. She was now the one being investigated. But the final twist. A week later, we got a letter in the mail, not from the police, not from the HOA, but from Karen herself, handwritten, no return address. One short sentence: "You've made a big mistake." And just like that, the story wasn't quite over after all. Getting that handwritten note from Karen was unsettling, but not surprising. Even after everything that happened, being exposed, publicly called out, and flagged by dispatch, she still couldn't admit she was wrong. But instead of reacting with anger or letting it get to us, my wife and I chose to focus on what came next. We turned everything over to the authorities and the HOA board, who finally opened a formal review of her actions. Several neighbors even submitted their own footage and written complaints. It was like a dam had broken, and people were finally ready to speak up. A month later, the HOA sent out a letter to all residents announcing that Karen had officially been removed from her unofficial compliance role and would no longer be representing the board in any way. They even outlined a new policy requiring written approval for property inspections, along with mandatory ID tags for any board-related visits. It was a small win, but it made a big difference. Things around the neighborhood started to shift. People felt more relaxed, less like they were constantly being watched. We hosted a small cookout to thank the neighbors who stood by us, and it ended up being the most social the block had felt in a long time. Karen still lives a few streets over, but she's been keeping her distance. No more surprise visits, no more phone calls. The biggest takeaway from all of this: sometimes standing up to the one person who tries to control everything is what helps everyone else breathe a little easier. And in our case, having the truth, a camera, and a 911 dispatcher for a wife didn't hurt either. This wasn't just about trespassing. It was about drawing the line and finally saying enough is enough.